So hello and welcome to Offset Warehouse's ethical embroidery workshop. We are an ethical and sustainable textile shop operating online, and we've been around now for about 11 years. We were founded to bring small fabric quantities to designers and makers, which at the time was actually difficult to get hold of. Sustainability and ethics is actually relatively newly talked about. We operate as a social business that brings people together using textiles as the heart. And this means that we work to support primarily small communities and hand weavers or small producers who are making these beautiful fabrics with ethical and sustainable fibres and in ethical and sustainable ways, so that you as a designer or a maker can access these materials and continue the story and support their livelihoods. We love to educate on the craft and communicate the origin, bringing the supply chain together so that, as I mentioned, the story can continue. But we like to do this through embroidery workshops, through panel discussions, and also just through having the fabrics available. So we work with our producers and we select our fabrics based on what they look like, how they feel, whether it's in trend. Even though trans-seasonality is a thing now for designers, and also when you're home sewing, you're just making something that you like, we want to make sure that there is fashion at the heart of what we're doing, because this is where it started. And with that, it means that we can continue and keep up the demand for these textiles. Because of this, we founded the Sustainable Fashion Collective, which is an online platform for designers and entrepreneurs to gain access for holistic resources that will guide them in implementing responsible practices. Whether you are just interested in textiles or you actually have a business, you work for a fashion brand, we are providing you with masterclasses on different topics across the design and fashion industry so that you can gain a bigger understanding. It's a complex world, and because of the knowledge that we have from the textiles and because of the questions a lot of makers have on where you can source materials and what even ethical and sustainability is, it means that we have this wonderful array of guest experts on our platform to help explain it and give you the inspiration and the motivation to change even the smallest thing. So we have our masterclasses and technical tutorials, we have interviews, and we also have a blog. And we want to stay up to date with industry news and the thoughts, what are the biggest topics of conversations at that time and how we can guide people so that we're looking towards the future. So I'm here doing this because my background is in fashion and my MA was focused on sustainable fashion. Throughout my career, I've worked for high-end small design studios, ethical brands, and also in a lot of high street fashion brands and also in retail. So my experience really spans the nitty-gritty of what makes up textiles and fashion. And my interest for this comes always from the origin of everything, where things come from. And it's the curiosity that led me to also become a food grower. I wanted to get really deep into where our stuff comes from. So I work part-time for Offset Warehouse and the Sustainable Fashion Collective, where I look after the sourcing, content and operations. And then 2 days a week, I'm also a food grower. I'm working in organic permaculture. So this is me here holding the flax from last year's harvest. The next picture is of natural dye experiments. I primarily like to use plants that I've foraged and also food waste. And then the last image is of one of my MA collection pieces where I foraged flowers from my local area, dried them and put them in PVC. So returning that story. And everything that I do encompasses this value of where things come from, how they're going to end up. And this is very much within the mission of Offset Warehouse and the Sustainable Fashion Collective. So before I go any further into talking about what ethical and sustainable textiles and fashion is about and how you can implement that into your own lifestyle, we should get started on the embroidery in case you have something that you'd already like to get going with. So when it comes to embroidery, whether you are completely new to it or experienced, you always need to consider your fabric, but really anything goes. For the purpose of this workshop, we are looking at reworking an existing garment or accessory. So your main focus really is that the fabric is washed. If you've not washed it already, then don't worry, you can always go back and do that afterwards. But this is just to ensure that the tension is correct. So with fabric you can use woven or knitted. It does help if you have a little bit of understanding, but I'm going to cover that later on. If you have something really simple to get started with, then you can get going. All you need is a needle, a thread, and sometimes a hoop. With your needle, you generally want a needle that's quite pointy and sharp. This helps get through the woven fabric, especially if it's densely woven. But you do need to consider the thickness of the needle. So if you're, for instance, embroidering silk, then it's very, very fine and densely woven. So you want a thin needle. If you're embroidering something that's a bit chunkier, like a wool, then a thicker needle works well. And this also is dependent on the embroidery thread or the yarn that you use. You would use a blunt needle usually if you're darning, because then you're not going to catch the threads of the original garment and raise them up. And it just means that you're going to prevent laddering. But generally, if you don't have much equipment, then you can still just get on with embroidery. You don't really need to invest that heavily. With thread, again, anything goes, but you want to make sure that what you're using works with the fabric. So usually if you're stitching on a general woven cotton, you'd want to use an embroidery cotton. This is because it's quite smooth. You can change the 6 threads within that thread into 4. So if you look at embroidery thread, it's quite thick, but you can split it. And the same goes for silk thread. You might be using this if you're working on a finer material or if there's something quite luxurious. You could also use fine wool yarn, and this is especially beneficial for when you're darning. And the key consideration here in terms of sustainability is how you're going to wash that garment. So I mentioned already cotton on cotton, and with wool you want to use a wool yarn. Most wool yarns will have a polyamide composition, and this helps with the durability and the strength. So if you're embroidering just for artwork, you don't really need to think about these, but if you're looking at your clothing, then considering the needle, the thread and the fabric as your tools and thinking about how you're actually going to use it will mean that all of that hard work that you put into the embroidery isn't going to be wasted if you wash it and it shrinks or it mats, for instance, with wool. And then the hoop just helps keep tension. So again, you don't need to invest in a hoop. They are around maybe £4 to £5, and you want to get one that's of a better quality, not one from that massive marketplace, because you do want it to be circular and strong. So it is beneficial. It helps to keep the tension. It also gives you something to hold on to. So if you're embroidering a t-shirt, it means that you don't need to keep going through the neck or the hem. So it helps with the manoeuvrability. For the purpose of this workshop, you can just listen along, or if you have any of these, then you can get started. So you should already have a handout of basic embroidery stitches. The one that we're going to focus on is the running stitch. It's really versatile. You don't need to know anything additionally fancy because you can already do a lot with this. If you look down, you can see that the whipped running stitch is just the running stitch with the thread laced around it. You've got the double laced running stitch, the interlaced running stitch. They're all running stitches, but with different things going on. And you can create a lot of effects depending on how long your dash and dot are. You have other ones like the stem stitch, split stitch, you've got your blanket stitch and your lazy daisy. Those are all a little bit fancy, but they have their own benefits. So blanket stitch, for instance, if you are hemming the edge of something, that's where it comes from the blanket. You've got your cross stitch if you want that particular style. And the lazy daisy is just a really nice little motif. So it depends on what you are embroidering, what the purpose of it is. But if you, for instance, with this workshop, are doing a slogan, or you're just reworking something to update it, add a little bit of jazz, then a running stitch is all you really need to know. So with the running stitch, you are basically threading your needle, putting it through the cloth, and then choosing where your dash and dot should be, so how long it should be, and that's determined by where you put the needle in and bring it back out again. A note on the thread that you're using: the rule of thumb is to not make your thread any longer than the length of the tip of your finger to your elbow, and this is because it will prevent any tangling when you're stitching. So even if you're doing a lot of embroidery work, it makes sense to keep the lengths quite short. You don't need to knot the thread beforehand. What you can do to avoid that bulk on the back of your piece is just to leave a length of thread and make sure when you pull the needle through, that thread stays at the back. Once you start stitching, that thread will then be retained in place. It depends on what you're comfortable with, but the knotting process is not always necessary. Then we've got the satin stitch, which really is just a long running stitch, but it's used to fill a shape. So you can see here in this image that it's a little leaf or teardrop, and the threads are both running vertically and landscape. It could take some practice to make sure that the edges are even, but it's a really quick way to fill in a lot of work. So it is just a glorified running stitch. You go in and out again, and that's all you really need to know, especially for this workshop. So you've also got handouts of some slogans. You can use these as they are, or you can mix them up. You can see in the image that this lady is part of our embroidery workshop in the past. Chose her own, and she simply just wrote the letters on. So what you want to do is choose your design. You trace out your design onto tracing paper, cut out the tracing paper design, leaving some room around the edges for pinning. Position your tracing paper on your garment or accessory and pin in place. You might want then to put the accessory or garment on to check the placement. And then you can mark out your embroidery design onto your fabric using a washable pen or pencil. You can sometimes also get a paper where it will transfer it, but you need to ensure that the image is a mirror image. It works the same way with t-shirt printing. But as with the previous image, that attendee just drew directly onto the fabric. So again, it depends on what you're doing and your confidence levels. If you're doing a slogan with lots of letters and you want the lettering to be a certain font, then the tracing paper is probably more beneficial. And then you can put the hoop on to help the tension and manoeuvrability. So we are now going to move on to the next part of the workshop, where I explain a bit more about fabrics and fibres in details and what makes them ethical and sustainable, and how you can use that in your lifestyle as mentioned. But if you do have something to get started with your embroidery, then do just give it a go. Try not to think too much about it. You're already taking a wonderful first step by being part of this workshop and thinking about reworking or upcycling a garment or an accessory to give it a little bit more life. And you'll probably feel really satisfied at the end, and you'll want to use that product even more. So let's move on. So what does ethical mean? Ethical mostly considers the social impact of whatever it is you're using, whether that's construction, for building, or if it's a textile, or if it's some food. It generally refers to people, but wrapped up in that is animals, because we're looking at morals, we're looking at values. Some people would refer to the planet too, because the soil and plants are also living, but it always comes back to that social impact. When we look at fashion and textiles, it refers to fair wages, safe working conditions, non-exploitative practices for adults and children, and extends to issues caused through this, such as poverty, hunger, unclean water. It can be difficult to measure, as each country has different labour laws, different levels of living wage, and cultural variations. So when it comes to fashion and textiles particularly, there are a lot of blurred lines. It can sometimes involve your own background and culture as to how you view the ethics of something, but for the most part we are concentrating on the fair wages, safe working conditions, non-exploitative. These are the backbone of the ethical fashion industry today, and what we can actually measure from country to country. When it comes to sustainable, this primarily refers to the environmental impact, but it should also consider personal and social. As with ethics, it involves everything, whether that's the land or the people, and everything has an impact on something else. The word sustainable actually comes from being able to sustain something, so that can be both good and bad. When it comes to fashion and textiles, we are considering the sustainability of the raw material. So, for instance, with cotton, we are looking at how much water is used, what the farmer's livelihood is like. With the processing, we are looking at how that material goes from the fibre into a yarn and then into a fabric. And all of the energy and water, the chemicals involved, the workers' livelihoods. Then we move on into the production phase, so taking that fabric or yarn and making a garment from it. Again, this is the energy, water, chemicals, workers' livelihoods. We move into the use phase, and this is more about the individual. This is how you are using the garment. And then it's your impact on the environment. So how you are using that garment, such as when you're washing it, how you're discarding of it. And then that brings it to the end of life. In all of these elements, we are looking at the waste that is also produced. So zero waste is a term that, yes, means that you are limiting what you use, but nothing is zero waste because you are using energy in the form of heat or electricity, you are using water. Something will go somewhere else. And when we're looking at the end of life of something and considering the ethics and sustainability of it, we are looking at circularity. We want to make sure that the value inherent in that product, that raw material, can go back into a system and be used again. Everything will end up somewhere, but it's making the decision to make it so that it goes somewhere beneficial. When it comes to understanding the sustainability and ethics of fashion and textiles, it does help in understanding where fibres come from. So at the top left here we have a sheep, and this is of course wool and other animal hairs. It's important to note that this is a byproduct of the meat and dairy industry. There are some animals that are reared primarily for their fibre anyway, but there is also other systems at play, like they might regenerate the land, it does offer food. So in looking at the ethics and sustainability of a fibre like wool, we need to consider everything, not just the textiles. Below that we have trees. This one is in particular a beech tree, which makes modal. All of the fibres like viscose, or another name for it is rayon, bamboo, modal, lyocell, or the brand name tencel, they all come from trees. And so with this we are considering where that tree actually comes from. Is it sustainably managed? Is it affecting indigenous communities? Below that we have natural rubber, which comes from trees solely found in the Amazon rainforest. You won't really find natural rubber today unless it's stated, because as you can imagine there isn't much of it, and synthetic rubber is just cheaper and easier and quicker to make. If we go across to the right, this is flax, and flax makes linen. It is primarily grown in the Benelux countries, so France, Belgium, the Netherlands, also in Lithuania, China. It's quite vast. It can be grown in many places, and there's also the variety of linseed, which goes towards food. It's a really beneficial crop for the land, and it's part of a fibre group called bast fibres, which also involves hemp. To the right we have a fibre called sisal, which is used for products like rope and twine. It's incredibly strong, and it's a group that come from leaves. So we've also got pineapple and banana. They're also leaf fibres. Above that we of course have cotton. It's quite an ubiquitous fibre that everyone knows. It is a seed hair, so the hair is what we harvest and gather up to make the fibre, and then the seed is actually used to make products like vegetable oil. So again, it's another crop that has its finger in many systems. Above that we have silk, which comes from silkworms, or otherwise a caterpillar that will then evolve into a moth. We get silk from the cocoon that the caterpillar spins, and with this we have both conventional, so less good, and pea silk, which is more animal friendly. To the left of that we have minerals. This is probably not something you would generally come across, but you might have heard of it. So minerals like silver, even though it's a metal, we do need to consider this in fashion and textiles. This is used to increase the antibacterial nature of socks, and you also can find it with metallic fibres. Below that, this squiggly picture is of all of the synthetics, and synthetics are man-made fibres, and they come from polymers that are made from oil. So every synthetic we have comes from the land, but comes from oil, and we need to remember that all of our fibres do actually come from the land in some way. Knowing where your fibres come from will help you in understanding if a garment will be comfortable for you, if it'll protect you, if it will perform, also how do you wash it. And it can also inform your decisions on ethics and sustainability. For instance, if you're vegan, if you have allergies to wool, if you want to not support deforestation, if you are concerned about water usage, if you want to choose something that's more locally produced. Having this knowledge just helps a little bit in giving you informed decision making. So when we look at the global fibre production, we can see that polyester takes up 52% of global fibre production, while cotton is 23% and wool is just 1%. It really helps put perspective on where we use our fibres and how much. But why cotton and why polyester? So polyester is super cheap to produce. When we consider it in comparison to cotton, this requires land, it requires water and a lot of workers. With polyester, you are taking just the oil from the ground, you are producing little plastic pellets, you put them in a machine where it melts down, and from this you extrude it into a fibre, sort of like dripping syrup from a spoon. So if you can imagine it getting thinner and thinner. And through various different processing, you then harden this and make your yarn, which is what you make the fabric from. With cotton, it's so lengthy. You've got to sow the seeds, look after the crop, harvest it, and then you go through all of the processes, which is you've got your sorting and your ginning, and then you've got your spinning. Every process is very labour intensive. So even if you're doing it conventionally, or organically. So organic is without pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers. There's generally better working conditions. No matter what way you're doing it, there's a lot of energy involved, both from our planet and from people. With polyester, all you need to do is put it in a machine, and it's quick and it's easy and it's accessible. And with that comes the fact that it is really versatile. You can do a lot with it. It goes into our performance fabrics, our plastics that we use every day, whereas cotton can be a little bit limiting. We generally don't want to wear it to go and work out in the gym. When we look at fabrics or fibres like wool, it's a little bit disappointing because wool actually has that performance capability. It's very strong, it's very versatile, but because it is land intensive, because it comes from an animal, and there isn't the demand for it because we love polyester so much and other synthetics, it doesn't really get a look in. The key issues when it comes to looking at the sustainability of fibres tends to be the carbon footprint and the water footprint. And we can see in these graphs from WRAP that it is primarily the extraction and the use phase of clothing that is most carbon intensive. When it comes to water, it's primarily the fibre production. So if sustainability for you looks at the carbon footprint and the water footprint, then considering how you use your garments might actually play a little bit more into what you choose to wear. Across the EU and the UK, clothing is the 8th largest sector in terms of household spending, but it's ranked 4th in terms of impact on the environment. In 2016, it was estimated that 1,130,000 tonnes of clothing was purchased in the UK alone. But WRAP's consumer research has found that on average, clothing lasts for 3.3 years before it's discarded or passed on. The amount of clothing in active use in the UK then, in 2016, was calculated as 3.6 million tonnes. So it means that we have a lot of clothes and we generally don't keep them for that long. If we consider what it was like in the past, we're always going on about the past, but make do and mend, austerity, we valued what we had and used it and reworked it, upcycled it, passed it on. It meant that clothing lasted for much longer, whether it was in the original clothing form or as something else like a blanket. The amount of clothing that was found in household residual waste has reduced by 50,000 tonnes. This means the amount of clothing that's just been put in a normal bin, so it goes straight to landfill or incineration. That value ends as soon as you put it in a bin. 700,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide are saved through people changing their clothing care habits though. And switching to sustainable fibres offers the biggest opportunities for environmental savings. So while discard is on the rise, there is an awareness of how we can do it differently and do it better. One of the biggest things that you can do if you are discarding your clothing, because you can't rework it or upcycle it or pass it on or sell it, is to put it in a textile bank or donate it to charity. At least then, even if it isn't in good condition, it can still go to textile recycling. It's a mechanical recycling process, so it won't be turned back into clothes again, unless it gets into the waste stream of a brand like H&M, who are working with mills to make a recycled fibre. But generally, with our current infrastructure, as soon as you put it in a bin, it ends there. So just taking the next step and putting that clothing in a textile bank or donating to charity does have a little bit more benefit. We still need to consider the fact that we are exporting that waste. So just by being here and listening and doing your embroidery and considering what it is that you have and how you can change your clothing care habits is a really massive step for environmental savings and valuing what it is that you have and chose to purchase. So moving now on to our fabrics, I'm going to quickly run through some of our favourite fabrics in our stock, but also the fibres and the fabrics that maybe you should be considering when you're looking at bringing environmental sustainability and ethics into your life. So the first one is handwoven. We absolutely love handwoven fabrics. There's just no real way to explain the beauty of it until you hold them. And especially if you go and see it in process, it's exceptionally slow. This image here is of a weaver with a backstrap loom, and it takes about 3 months to weave just 1 metre of fabric. It just means that you are really in line with that person's life, that you are part of that story. And it means that every single metre is different. You are supporting livelihoods, and there's no way around it really, but when you're British, you've really got to consider the colonialism as well, and it's a really difficult subject, but supporting the heritage of crafts such as spinning and weaving means that the livelihoods are retained, the skills are retained and passed on, and it's giving an opportunity for a different line of work. The cities are incredibly busy, and we're seeing a resurgence of people wanting to move away from that back into rural lives, and home working actually does offer that. We've just got to be very humble and appreciative of the wonder and beauty of these materials. Regenerative is perhaps a tricky one. You would never, at least not now, see it on a label. But when it comes to regenerative, what we're meaning is that the fibre or material is actually benefiting a system, and not just a system of where it came from, so a textile system, but food as well. So the Beyond Cotton initiative are working with cotton farmers to grow food alongside that. So cotton only grows for 4 months of a year, so you've got 8 months where you can grow food. And then we've got designer Alice Robinson. She is designing and researching on using a whole animal to make products, and that is using the leather or skin to make the products, but then also using the meat. She is looking at a regional fibre shed model, so how can we have local production? You're not going to find this in fashion right now, but you can ask about it. And it just means that we are looking at our fibres in a holistic system. We're not just looking at them as this extractive process where we're taking it from the land, using it and discarding it. We're considering where it comes from and each step with that, how it benefits the environment, how it benefits people. Recycled fibres, actually, you will likely see a lot more now. It's frankly a major marketing claim to have a recycled fibre. They are more expensive to produce. If you look at the pictures here of waste savers, you have to sort the clothing into what can still be sold in charity shops and on second-hand marketplaces. And then what isn't very good can go for mechanical recycling. On the right here we have an old shoddy mill, which, recycling is a really old industry. And again, it was that value inherent in the cloth, and so using it to make rags or filler, or recycling it again to make fibre. But because of these additional steps, it does put the price up. The benefit of recycled fibres is that we are not taking anything from the land. We're not using virgin fibre, so it does actually cut out a lot of the water usage and the carbon footprint that we saw in the graphs. And from it, you can actually have still a wonderfully integral fibre. They're usually blended with something else to make them stronger or to add to the characteristics. But you have recycled fibres from polyester, so PET bottles, you have nylon from fishing nets, you have recycled cotton. But all of these, again, don't use virgin fibres. There are, of course, questions about microfibre pollution, but for garments that do require a synthetic material such as in performance wear, then using a recycled version at least can offset some of those issues for the time being. But there are new innovations that really excite us. So, for example, AgriLoop, they take agricultural waste such as hemp straw, rice straw, this goes into a machine, and then out comes a cellulosic fibre, so you can make a viscose from it. And this is really beneficial for the farmers because then they have an additional income, but also there is no burning of the agricultural waste. That's better for emissions. And then you have a new really cool fibre. You've got circulose, which started off as being recycled from denim. We have a lot of denim, and from this they can again make a cellulose fibre. This is actually being used already for H&M. And then we have Eco now, which comes from the recycled fishing nets. And the benefit of this is that a lot of these initiatives now are working with local communities to give additional access to jobs, and also we're cleaning up the oceans. With all of this, there needs to be accreditation and validation. So, for example, with the plastic bottles in the top right, there was a time when new plastic bottles were being used for the fibre because of the increase in demand. So you need to be sure that when you're buying fabric or buying a garment, that there is an accreditation such as the Global Recycled Standard. Our other top fabric pick is hemp, linen and nettle, which are all bast fibres. So they come from the stalk or stem of a plant. And these are all just naturally strong. They are really beneficial for the land because they just grow really well. They have a long root structure, which helps retain moisture and prevent erosion. They are good for the biodiversity, for pollinators, but they are labour intensive to produce. Whether you are doing it with machinery or by hand, it takes a long time, it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of energy. So there are considerations to make. And again, accreditations help, or asking where you're purchasing the garment or the fabric from, asking the supplier or the brand where the fibre actually came from, because there are both good and bad elements of it. But in terms of what it feels like on your skin, they offer that temperature regulation. They are both good in winter and in summer. They are really versatile, so you can blend it with silk, you can make it really heavy duty for upholstery. It's really vast, and again, all of these are food. You've got your hemp for your oils and your CBD, you've got linen for your flaxseed, and you've got nettle, which is an amazing herb. There's also Lyocell and modal, which is really wonderful for the fashion industry because it is making us go away from synthetics. So to be clear, Lyocell and modal are a regenerated fibre. So they are sort of not natural, not synthetic. They come from a natural source, such as bamboo, beech trees, eucalyptus, and then through a chemical process with solvents, they are turned into a cellulosic fibre and then made into your fabric. What's different with these is the wood sources are sustainably managed. They come usually from Forest Stewardship Council certified or an alternative, and then the production process is closed loop. So all of that solvent will stay in a loop and won't reach a water source. So in terms of energy, water, there is more of a benefit to this, especially if we're looking at regeneration. As soon as you deforest a tree, you are planting another one. You know, it's trying to ensure that we're keeping it in a loop. We want to make sure that everything we do doesn't have an A and a B. You know, it goes all the way around. There are, of course, also real innovations in alternatives such as mushroom leather, apple leather, pineapple leather. Again, you need to consider the pros and cons and how it fits in with your ethics and your sustainability. There are real benefits socially for the resurgence and development in these materials, because then we are then looking at the origin and how to protect these sources so that we can use them, they can thrive and provide a local economy. But at the same time, when there ends up being too much demand for one thing, it can have a knock-on effect that you maybe don't see for a few years. So it's really necessary to bear in mind that everything has a good and a bad point, and it always comes back to how you're going to use that product, how often you're going to use that product. So it's no good saying you discard something after 3.3 years. If you've only worn it once in that 3.3 years, then it's not sustainable. So every fibre, every fabric, every garment that you purchase, consider every element of it. Even if it doesn't have accreditations, it might be good in some other way. So, along with choosing clothing that you will wear regularly for over 3 years, so as not to play into that statistic, you are looking at the labels. This doesn't just mean the product descriptions and the care label, but feel the garment, understand the fibre and the fabric, how it makes you actually feel. Does it provide you shelter, warmth? Does it make you feel comfortable? Does it increase your confidence? You're the one that's going to be using it. So if it doesn't offer you something personally, then perhaps that's not sustainable. Consider as well how it fits into your lifestyle. So how are you going to wash it? Can you move in it? Is it versatile? Can you use it for work and for play? Before you buy it, it's also beneficial to know if the brand offers repairs or if you can repair it yourself. If it's a really complicated design, would a repair shop know how to change it? Will it cost you more to repair it than to buy something new, and so will you just get fed up? Will it have life after you've used it? So this is thinking about that circular system. Think about the quality. If it's a poor quality to begin with, then it's not going to have as much value when it gets to the end of its life. If it's a better quality, you're more likely to keep it for longer anyway, but then the next person, the next person, the next person to use it, or if it's used again for a fibre, that value and that quality will be retained. You can also assess the accreditations, the openness of the brand, and try to discover where it fits on your scale of ethics. Again, it goes back to the good and bad. Something might not be high enough in one area, but it could be in another, and that's where you balance it out. And then the other option, of course, is to make your own clothing. This is where you have a bit more control over what fabrics you use, how it's constructed, and you might have a bit more satisfaction and appreciation for how long it takes to produce something. So thank you so much for watching and attending this workshop. You can find us here at these websites, and also please do follow us on social media. We'd also love to share what it is that you've been making. And if you do have any other questions, then please don't hesitate to email or send us a message.